The first red flag wasn't an Oppos. T, the rusted padlock, or the fact that the driveway looked like it had an Oppos. T, seen a tire in half a decade. It was the woman in the oversized sunglasses and a crisp, white polo standing on the porch like she was waiting for a pizza delivery that was 20 minutes late. I had just closed on this place, a rugged little A-frame cabin tucked away in a corner of Blackwood Ridge, a spot so quiet you could hear the pine needles hitting the ground, or so I thought. The deal was as clean as they come. A county foreclosure auction, cash on the barrelhead, deed in my name, and the kind of paperwork that makes a man feel like he's finally got a piece of the world to call his own. I'd spent my life in cramped apartments with thin walls and neighbors who thought 2 a.m. was the perfect time for a drum circle. So this cabin was my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude. But as I pulled my truck up the gravel path, there she was, arms crossed, jaw set, looking like she'd personally grown every tree on the mountain. End quote. Can I help you? End quote. She asked, her voice carrying that sharp, nasal edge that immediately tells you she's used to being the loudest person in the room. I stepped out, stretched my back after the long drive, and gave her a polite nod, thinking maybe she was just a concerned neighbor wondering why a beat-up Ford was parking in a dead man in Oppo's driveway. End quote. Just moving in, end quote. I said, jiggling the keys in my hand, end quote. I'm Elias, the new owner, end quote. She didn't Oppo's offer a name or a handshake. She just scoffed, a sound so full of disbelief it was almost impressive. End quote. I don an Oppo's. Thinks so, end quote. She said, stepping down one stair to maintain her height advantage, end quote. I'm Margaret Vance, president of the Blackwood Ridge Homeowners Association, and this property has been under our stewardship for the better part of 3 years. We've already filed the intent to annex, so whatever into Oppo's, auction in Oppo's, you think you attended was a mistake on the county into Oppo's, part, end quote. I just blinked at her, the mountain air suddenly feeling a lot colder than it had a minute ago. I told her straight up that the county didn't into Oppo's. T mentioned any HOA, and they certainly didn't into Oppo's. T mentioned a Margaret Vance, but she just shook her head like I was a toddler trying to explain how microwave works. End quote. It's in the bylaws, Elias, if I'm remembering your name correctly. And since this lot was abandoned, it reverted to community oversight, end quote. She said, her eyes tracking me like a hawk as I walked past her toward the door. I didn't in Oppo's. T want to fight on day one. So I just slid the key into the lock, turned it with a satisfying click, and pushed the door open. The interior smelled like old cedar and dust, but to me, it smelled like victory. Margaret gasped, an audible, theatrical sound that echoed off the trees. End quote. You are trespassing on HOA-managed property. I'm calling my attorney and the sheriff, and believe me, you'll be out of there by nightfall. End quote. I didn't in Oppo's. To even look back, just flipped the light switch, watched the dim bulbs flicker to life, and called out, end quote. Take it up with the county. Margaret, I've got the receipts in the truck if you need some light reading. End quote. I figured she was just a local busybody with a power trip. The kind of person who gets off on telling people their grass is an inch too long, but I seriously underestimated how deep the rot went in a place like Blackwood Ridge. The next morning, the sun hadn't into Oppo's. T even cleared the peaks when I found the first, end quote, gift, end quote, from my new friend. A bright neon pink sticker was plastered right across the front window, declaring the structure, end quote, unfit for human occupancy, end quote, due to, end quote, community safety violations, end quote. I was standing there in my boxers, coffee in hand, trying to peel the sticky residue off when I heard the slow crunch of tires on gravel. Margaret was back, this time in a golf cart, accompanied by a man who looked like he'd been vacuum sealed into a suit 2 sizes too small. End quote. That's him, Harold, end quote. She pointed, not even looking at me, end quote. The squatter, end quote. Harold, apparently the HOA's legal muscle, stepped out and handed me a cease and desist letter that looked like it had been written by a 3rd grader with a legal dictionary. They were claiming I was performing, end quote, unauthorized renovations, end quote, because I'd changed the locks and swept the porch. It was so absurd, I actually laughed, which, looking back, was probably the moment I became public enemy number 1. End quote. Listen, Margaret, Harold, whatever this is, it's not working, end quote. I told them, leaning against the doorframe, end quote. I checked the plat maps before I bid. This lot was carved out of the original subdivision back in the 70s. It's unincorporated. I'm not in your club. I don't owe you dues, and I definitely don and oppos. T need your permission to be in my own living room. End quote. Margaret's face turned a shade of purple. I didn't in oppos. T no human skin could achieve. End quote. We are in the process of rectifying those maps. This ridge is a unified front, and we won in oppos. T have some outsider bringing down the property values with A and oppos. Fixer-upper and oppos. Attitude. End quote. They drove off in a huff, but I knew the type. People like Margaret, Don, and oppos. T just go away. They simmer until they boil over. That's why that evening, instead of unpacking my kitchen boxes, I was mounting 4 high-definition night vision cameras under the eaves and setting up a perimeter of motion sensors. I'm not a paranoid man by nature, but I've learned that the most dangerous animal in the woods, ISN and oppos. T a bear or a mountain lion. It's a bored woman with a clipboard and a sense of divine right. I was right to be cautious. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand with a motion alert. I pulled up the feed, and there she was, Margaret Vance, dressed in a dark tracksuit like she was on a covert op, creeping through my flower beds with a bucket of white paint. I watched, mesmerized by the sheer audacity, as she painted a giant end quote, X end quote, on my front door and then took a photo of it. The next morning, I had an email from the county building department, sent from A end quote, concerned citizen end quote, claiming there was an active hazardous waste spill on my property. When I went outside, the paint was dry, and a local deputy was pulling into my drive. Deputy Miller was a young guy. Looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and when I showed him the footage on my tablet, he just sighed and rubbed his temples. End quote. Look, Elias, I know Margaret. She's persistent, but this is a civil matter unless I can prove intent to harass. End quote. I pointed at the end quote, X end quote, on my door. End quote. She's literally marking my house for death, Miller. That's trespass and vandalism. End quote. He told me he'd file a report, but hinted that in a small town, the end quote, old guard end quote, usually looks out for their own. That was the spark I needed. If the law was going to move slow, I was going to move fast. I spent the next 3 days at the county records office, and man, let me tell you, when you start pulling the thread on a small town HOA, you don and oppos. T just find a mess, you find a crime scene. I met a clerk named Sarah, a woman who had clearly dealt with Margaret's paperwork for years and had the 1,000-yard stare to prove it. End quote. Oh, Blackwood Ridge, end quote, she whispered, leaning over the counter, end quote. They've been filing some very creative documents lately. End quote. She helped me pull the HOA's tax filings and the community grant applications. It turns out, 6 months ago, the HOA had applied for a $45,000 end quote, heritage restoration grant end quote, from the state. The centerpiece of their application, my cabin. They had listed it as an end quote, HOA-owned historical landmark end quote, and claimed they were using the funds to preserve the original stonework and roof. The kicker? The state had already cut them a check for the first half of the money, and it had been deposited into an account controlled solely by Margaret Vance and the HOA treasurer, who, surprise, surprise, was her brother-in-law. I felt this cold rush of adrenaline hit me. This wasn't an oppos. T, just a lady who hated my truck. This was a woman who had committed full-blown state-level fraud and was trying to drive me out before the state auditor showed up to see a cabin that was clearly not being, end quote, restored, end quote, by the HOA. I headed over to the neighboring lot to see if I could find some allies. That's where I met Silas, an old-timer who had been living on the ridge since the trees were saplings. He invited me in for a beer and told me the real story. Margaret had been, end quote, taxing, end quote, the residents for years for a, end quote, community pool, end quote, that never materialized, and anyone who asked questions suddenly found themselves buried in fines for, end quote, non-compliant window treatments, end quote, or, end quote, illegal bird feeders, end quote, end quote. She's had everyone scared, Elias, end quote, Silas said, his voice gravelly, end quote. She tells us she's got the county in her pocket, and after a while, you just start to believe it, end quote. I told Silas about the grant money, and the look on his face shifted from tired to tinderbox angry, end quote. She told us that grant was for the main road repairs. My truck suspension is shot because of the potholes on her watch, end quote. The escalation reached a fever pitch on Friday. I was in town grabbing supplies when Silas called me, his voice shaking. End quote. Elias, get back here. Margaret's got a demolition crew at your place. She's telling them the structure is condemned and has to come down today. End quote. I pushed that forward harder than I ever had, flying up the mountain roads. When I skidded into my driveway, a backhoe was idling 10 feet from my porch, and Margaret was standing there with a man in a hard hat, waving a piece of paper. I jumped out of the truck, phone recording, and stood right in front of the bucket. End quote. Back off. End quote, I yelled. Margaret stepped forward, her face a mask of cold triumph. End quote. The county has deemed this a public hazard, Elias. We are protecting the community. End quote. I held up my own folder. End quote. This is a private residence, Margaret. If that machine touches a single shingle, I'm suing you, the crew, and the HOA for every cent you've ever touched. And by the way, I just came from the state auditor's office. They're very interested in that $45,000 in oppos, restoration in oppos, U-Haven in oppos, T-done. End quote. The color drained from her face so fast, it was like someone pulled a plug. The guy in the hard hat looked at her, then at me, then at the backhoe. End quote. She said she had the permit. End quote. He muttered. I showed him my deed and the rejection letter from the county regarding her annexation attempt. He didn't end oppos. T say another word, just climbed into his rig and backed it down the drive, leaving Margaret standing in the dust. She tried to muster some dignity, adjusting her polo and glaring at me. End quote. This ISN and oppos. T over. You're destroying this community. End quote. I just smiled a real, genuine smile. Ikut. No, Margaret. I'm just the guy who bought the house you tried to steal. See you at the board meeting tomorrow night. End quote. The meeting was held in the local library's basement, a cramped room that smelled like old paper and desperation. The usual suspects were there, about 30 residents, most of them looking like they'd rather be getting a root canal. Margaret sat at the head of the table, flanked by Harold and her brother-in-law, looking like they were ready to conduct a funeral. She started with the usual fluff about, end quote, landscaping standards, end quote, but I didn't end oppos. T wait for her to finish. I stood up in the back, my folder tucked under my arm. End quote. I have a question for the board, end quote. I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. Margaret tried to gavel me down. End quote. This is a closed session for members only, Elias. You aren't an oppos, a member. End quote. I walked down the center aisle, handing out copies of the state grant application to every person in those folding chairs. End quote. Actually, I think everyone here is A and oppos, member and oppos, of the group you've been stealing from. Does anyone here remember voting to spend 45 grand of state money on a cabin that doesn't in oppos even belong to the HOA? End quote. The room erupted. Silas stood up, shouting about his truck suspension. A woman in the front row started crying, saying she'd been fined $500 for the color of her front door, while Margaret was pocketing thousands. Margaret tried to scream over the noise, her voice cracking, end quote. It was for the good of the ridge. We were going to use the leftover funds for the pool, end quote. I stepped right up to the table, leaning in so she could see the lack of fear in my eyes. End quote. There are no leftover funds, Margaret. I checked the ledger Sarah gave me. You've been paying your personal mortgage out of the end oppos, maintenance fund and oppos, for 18 months. The sheriff is waiting in the lobby, by the way. I figured it was easier than having him drive all the way up the mountain, end quote. The look on her face wasn't end oppos, even anger anymore. It was the look of a person realizing the ground they've been standing on for 20 years was actually just a thin layer of ice. Harold tried to slide out the back door, but 2 deputies were already coming through the front. The room didn't end oppos. T goes silent. It stayed loud, but it was the sound of a community finally breathing again. They took Margaret out in handcuffs, her white polo stained with the sweat of a ruined woman, screaming about how she built this place. Her brother-in-law followed shortly after, looking like he was about to vomit. In the weeks that followed, the Blackwood Ridge HOA was effectively dissolved. Turns out, once an auditor gets their teeth into a fraudulent organization, the whole thing falls apart like a house of cards. The state took their money back, well, what was left of it, and the residents voted to move to an, informal agreement, model, meaning they just talk to each other like human beings instead of filing paperwork. I spent my first real weekend of peace sitting on my porch, the finally sanded off and a fresh coat of stain on the wood. Silas came by with a case of beer, and we sat there watching the sunset over the ridge. Silas said, taking a long pull of his drink, people always say you can adopt fight City Hall. But I guess they never met a guy who just wanted to be left alone in his own cabin. I looked at the trees, the quiet, the absolute lack of neon pink stickers, and I realized that sometimes the only way to find peace is to be the one willing to start the biggest fire. Margaret is still tied up in court, facing felony fraud and embezzlement charges. And the rumor is she's trying to sell her own house just to pay for the lawyers. I almost feel sorry for her, almost. But then I remember her creeping through my flowers at 3 a.m. with a bucket of paint, and I think about the next person she would have bullied if I hadn't oppos. T shown up with a camera and a grudge. But here's the thing that's been eating at me, and I want to know what you guys think. After the HOA dissolved, some of the residents actually complained. They said that without Margaret's, strict standards, the neighborhood would go to hell. They'd rather have a thief in charge who keeps the grass short than the freedom to choose their own mailbox. It makes me wonder, do people actually crave being controlled? Is the Karen in a leopard print blouse just a product of people being too afraid to manage their own lives? Or did I just trade one kind of drama for a neighborhood that doesn't oppose? Know how to function without a dictator? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to take down a power-hungry HOA, or if you think I should have just moved out and let Margaret have her little kingdom. Don and Oppos, forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of people standing their ground, because sometimes the receipts are the only weapon you need.